I'm Tim, guitar player, teacher. Up to this point in this series, we've covered several different types of scales. The chromatic scale, the major scales, the natural, harmonic, and melodic minor scales, and the modes for each of them. We've also discussed intervals and the importance of being able to use scale formulas to label the structure of scales in relation to their parallel major scales. In this lesson, we're going to add a few additional types of scales to our ever-growing list. These are Symmetric Scales, Pentatonic Scales, and the Bebop Scales. First, we'll start with the Symmetric Scales. These scales are, as the name strongly implies, symmetric. In other words, the intervals used to create the scale will be the same throughout the entire scale. Unlike the major scale, minor scales, and the modes, the interval structure for these will not be described in relation to a parallel major scale. In the same way that the major scale was first built using the whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half pattern of intervals, the structure of these scales will also be described using half steps and whole steps. This makes the symmetry of their structure much easier to recognize. The first of these scales is one we've actually already learned, the chromatic scale. The chromatic scale is made up of all half steps, 12 of them to be exact. Because the intervals within the scale are all the same, it is considered a symmetric scale. Let's look at what we get if we use only whole steps instead of half steps. Our formula would be whole step, whole step, whole step, whole step, whole step, whole step. Starting on C, we would get C, D, E, F sharp or G flat, G sharp or A flat, A sharp or B flat, C. Since we used only whole steps to make this scale, it is called the whole tone scale. An interesting thing happens when we build symmetric scales in this way. When looking at a melody that uses a major scale, for example, it is very easy to find the tonic of the scale by simply looking for the half steps. We know that there will be a half step between the leading tone and the tonic, so we can use the diatonic half steps to help figure out the key or scale that's being used, even if we don't have a key signature to help. However, this scale has no half steps, so there is no clear and obvious tonic. Also, because all of the intervals are the same throughout the scale, the modes of this scale will all have the same formula, 6 whole steps. Therefore, any note of the scale could be considered the root. So, this group of notes make up 6 different whole tone scales. Which name we give it completely depends on how it's being used. Also, notice that it uses every other note of the chromatic scale. If we started a half step higher than C, we would get another whole tone scale that uses the other 6 notes of the chromatic scale: C sharp or D flat, D sharp or E flat, F, G, A, B, and C sharp or D flat. And just like before, any of the notes of this whole tone scale could be considered the tonic. Now again, we have to be careful about which note we call the tonic, but since there are only 2 groups of notes that make up any whole tone scale, we could say there are only 2 distinct whole tone scales. Here is the C whole tone scale. The scale sounds really tense, kind of eerie. It's used in movie scores quite often to create anticipation about the upcoming scene, and for good reason. It's definitely leading us into something, we're just not sure what. Our first symmetric scale was built using only 1 half step at a time. Then we used 2 half steps, or a whole step at a time. In fact, we could use any number of half steps that divides into 12 evenly to create more of these symmetric scales. 3 half steps, or a minor third, 4 half steps, or a major third, or 6 half steps, or a diminished fifth, would all create the same type of symmetry. However, using any interval larger than a whole step starts to create chords, and that's going to have to wait until we begin discussing them, otherwise it's going to get very confusing. There are also other symmetric scales that use a repeating combination of intervals. They are all typically related to chords, so we'll revisit them along with this entire concept of symmetric scales later, but here are a few examples. The whole half diminished scale uses a whole step, then a half step repeatedly. The half whole diminished scale uses a half step, then a whole step repeatedly. The augmented scale uses an augmented second, then a half step repeatedly. The next type of scale I'd like to discuss are called pentatonic scales. As the name suggests, these scales only have 5 notes in them, not counting the octaves. These are extremely common in modern music. The idea behind them is that we're going to take a diatonic scale and remove the half steps. This leaves the scales very open and less directed in regards to tension and resolution. Without half steps, we can be much more free in how we use these scales to create melodies. Let's look at an example. If we take the C major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C, the half steps are between E and F and B and C. To get rid of these 2 half steps, we need to get rid of 1 note from each of these groups. For harmonic reasons, the 3rd is much more important than the 4th, so we'll get rid of the 4th, F. And we clearly don't want to get rid of the tonic, so we'll get rid of the 7th, B. This leaves us with C, D, E, G, A, and C. This is called the C major pentatonic scale. Its formula is 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. If we look at the modes of this scale and the formulas for each of them, we get the following. The first mode is C, D, E, G, A. Its formula is 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. The second mode is D, E, G, A, C. Its formula is 1, 2, 4, 5, flat 7. The third mode is E, G, A, C, D. Its formula is 1, flat 3, 4, flat 6, flat 7. The fourth mode is G, A, C, D, E. Its formula is 1, 2, 4, 5, 6. The fifth mode is A, C, D, E, G. Its formula is 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7. Each of these modes have their uses, but the first and fifth modes are the 2 most commonly used. The first mode is the one that was built using the major scale and therefore is called the major pentatonic scale. The fifth mode is built off the relative minor. C major is relative to A minor and is therefore called the minor pentatonic scale. Now, that is not to say that the other modes are not useful. In fact, they are often preferred by improvisational artists specifically because they include more notes other than the chord tones, the 1, 3, 5, and 7, and therefore can sound a little outside the box. However, the first and fifth modes show up a great deal more often. Also, these are not the only pentatonic scales. There are lots of different pentatonic scales that are used in different genres of music in different parts of the world for a wide variety of reasons. Pentatonic scales are, as I said, extremely common and experimented with all the time. I will no doubt be mentioning some of these more exotic forms of the pentatonic scales at some point, but for now, the major pentatonic and the minor pentatonic are the 2 that we need to be aware of. Finally, there are the bebop scales. These are called bebop scales because they were used a great deal during the bebop era by such jazz greats as Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, and many others. These scales were actually created for rhythmic purposes. A normal measure of 4/4 time would have 8 eighth notes per measure. That's actually why they're called eighth notes. However, our diatonic scales only have 7 notes in them, so they don't fit the measure perfectly. Adding one additional note would fix this and allow for the tonic to land on the downbeat of the next measure. Because of which note is being added, it also puts all of the chord tones on the downbeats throughout the measure and makes the scale sound much more melodic. So, each of these scales is created by taking one of the diatonic scales and adding an additional note to them as a passing tone. There are several bebop scales, but the most common ones are the bebop major scale and the bebop dominant scale. The bebop major scale is a major scale with an augmented fifth added. Its formula is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sharp 5, 6, 7, 8. Notice that each chord tone lands on a beat. In jazz, the chord tones of a major chord are the 1, the 3, the 5, and the 6. Also, notice the tonic lands on the downbeat of the second measure. It sounds like it fits the measure much better. The bebop dominant scale is mixolydian with a major seventh added. Its formula is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 7, and 8. Again, notice how the chord tones, and for a dominant chord they are the 1, the 3, the 5, and the flat 7, all land on each beat, and the tonic falls on the downbeat of the second measure. As I said, these scales are primarily associated with the improvisational playing of the bebop era of jazz. However, they also provide some very interesting harmonic functions that we will get into later. These are the last of the scales that we'll be adding to our scale knowledge for now. If you haven't already, check the links in the description for some free PDFs you can download to help keep up with this and all the other videos in this series so far. They all send you to the same page of my website, so you don't need to go back through each of the videos to get to all of them. I hope they help. The goal of this series is to help build an understanding of the basic principles of music. However, we can't do that if we don't understand the tools that are used to create music in the first place. For melody, that typically means scales, and that's why so much time has been spent on making sure we have a good vocabulary of scales and at least a little understanding of how they're built and where they come from. For harmony, that means chords, and that's what our next few videos will be covering, starting with triads. Until then, thanks for taking the time to watch. If you find this video helpful, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see the rest of the series. I'm also planning on starting to post some guitar-related videos soon, so be watching for that as well. And like always, I greatly appreciate your time. Take care.